recording now. So my name is Ethan Tapper. I'm the Chittenden County Forester for the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. And I'm here today in partnership with the Access program at CVU, which is this really cool program at CVU High School in Heinsberg, where you can learn to do all kinds of cool stuff. I took a welding class there. They teach foreign languages and instruments. It's this really neat community program that's designed for people like us who are just curious and like to learn stuff. And so I'd highly recommend checking out CVU's stuff. What I do most of the time, I know I see a lot of familiar faces here, but if we haven't met before and you don't know what a county forester does, the County Forester program has been around in Vermont since the 1940s, and our primary job is to help the owners of privately owned forested land manage their land better. And there's a lot of different pieces and parts to that, but one of the sort of the big exciting pieces is just sort of answering this question of how we elevate the quality of forest management and the health of forests in our county. And each county is really different people, different forests, different stuff going on. And so that's where we, are able to sort of be creative and sort of address things as we see them. And so the presentation that I'm going to do, which I call the Radical Forest Manager, is sort of a reflection of that, thinking about this bigger picture view of, we're going to try and encapsulate a lot of different stuff, a sort of reimagined vision of what forests are and how they work, and addressing some of those common misconceptions that we have about how forests work, talking about some of the legacy that we inherit with our forests, and then also, sort of reframing the discussion of how we think about managing them and intervening them, with not just thinking about forests and trees, but also how is this a part of building a better world, and all of this really other important stuff in our communities and across our world, like justice and equity. How do we incorporate that into the way that we manage our ecosystems? And of course, if you've ever, sort of studied up on environmental justice and stuff like that, you'll know that they are absolutely connected and integrated. So with that, I am just going to start the presentation. And I'll also say that please do, if you have any questions, just when you think of them, just pop them in the chat and we'll have time at the end to answer them. All right, away we go. I hope. All right, so the Radical Forest Manager is what I'm calling this presentation. My name is Ethan Tapper. I'm the Chittenden County Forester. Again, I work for the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. That's my email. It's really easy. You can just search for Chittenden County Forester or Ethan Tapper, and it'll pop right up. So when I talk about this presentation, and there have been some discussions about, I know Jeff's on here. We've had discussions about whether radical is or is not the best word to use to describe this. But when I'm talking about sort of the radical forest manager, I'm talking about sort of two different definitions. One is this original definition of radical as being relating to or affecting the fundamental nature of something, very different from the usual or traditional, favoring perhaps extreme changes in existing views, habits, conditions, or institutions. So reframing the way, in a radical way, sort of at the root, the way we think about forests and the way we think about our relationship to them and how we manage them, but also incorporating this sort of second, newer definition of radical, which is advocating or based on or favoring drastic political, economic, or social reforms. So thinking about the ways in which that we manage our ecosystems can also be part of having healthy communities and having a more just world. Sort of playing with both of those definitions at the same time. And this is the way that I think about it is, I sort of, in thinking about forests and in thinking about communities and equity and all this other stuff, realize that we were sort of either thinking about totally about forests, or we were thinking totally about people, but not thinking about what happens when those two things are integrated, as they are, whether we realize it or not. And so as forest managers, we're asking, how can we make forests healthier? Or as community members, we're asking, how can we make our communities healthier? But we're not ever asking ourselves, how do forests and ecosystems and the way that we take care of them are part of how we build a better world? And that better world includes forests, and it includes people, and lots of other stuff. And so here's sort of the roadmap for this discussion, and sort of this language that I've been building to talk about these ideas, or collecting to talk about these ideas. The first part is what I call reimagining forests. So what are forests and how do they work? Seems pretty basic, but there are a lot of misconceptions about what forests are and about how they work. Second part is legacy. So thinking about what legacies do we inherit in our world, and how do we leave a better legacy for future generations? The third part is responsibility, asking what is our responsibility to our forests, to each other, to future generations. The fourth part is relationship, asking how our actions impact our ecosystems and each other, or acknowledging that they do, and then asking ourselves, how do we develop a relationship with forests that's complex, nuanced, and that takes a broader view? And finally, thinking about power. How do we use the power and the privilege that we have to enrich ecosystems and each other, both locally and globally? So the first part is reimagining forests. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. I always include this slide in almost every presentation I do, because everybody seems to think that a forest is a bunch of trees, right? You look it up in the dictionary, you're like, yep, you know, it's a bunch of trees. It's a large area covered chiefly with trees and undergrowth. It's a dense growth of trees and shrubs covering a large area. It's a bunch of trees, and you walk into a forest and you know you're in a forest because there are trees there, right? Well, the trees are a part of it, but actually this sort of definition of a natural community is a much better indicator of what my sort of reimagined understanding of what a forest is, what it looks like. And so this definition, which comes from the book Wetland, Woodland, Wildland by Liz Thompson, Eric Sorensen, is an interacting assemblage of organisms, their physical environment, and the natural processes that affect them. So it's broadening this definition of what a forest or any other kind of an ecosystem is, to include not just the trees, which are sort of the most obvious and charismatic part, but also all of these other pieces and parts. There are many different organisms and processes that have these complex relationships that are absolutely critical to how forests work. And so if we just sort of focus on the trees, we're leaving out all this other stuff, which is important, not just because that stuff is interesting and neat and important, but because actually that's how forests work. And so if we're not managing forests for all of that stuff, we're not managing forests in a way that is responsible, that is sustainable, and that makes sense. I think of a forest sort of like, or I think of the trees in a forest as like the coral in a coral reef. So when you think about a coral reef, sure, you think about the coral, which is this sort of living structure that sort of everything else is built around, which is like the trees. But when you think about a coral reef, what you really think about is this massive web of life that's swirling around that coral, right? And so in the case of forests, this is birds and animals and fungi and microorganisms and vertebrates, little bugs, and all this other stuff. That's the forest. And so when we think about taking care of and managing the forest, if we're just taking care of trees, we're not taking care of the forest, because the forest is all of that stuff. And we're not doing good management unless we're taking care of all of that. So as we reimagine forests, we need to sort of address this thing that is inside all of us, this misunderstanding about what a healthy forest looks like. So everybody looks into a forest like this, with big, evenly spaced trees and nothing growing in the understory, and they're like, wow, this is really great. This is perfect. This is what a forest is supposed to look like. And as you actually study forest ecology, what you learn is that this is completely a reflection of our own aesthetic biases, and has absolutely nothing to do with what any healthy forest looks like in the world. It just looks good to us. And if that looks good to you, that's completely normal. One thing I've realized in talking to people is that an understanding of what healthy forests actually look like is not something that is intuitive to most people. It's something that we need to develop. And so if this looks good to you, that's completely normal. But this is what healthy forests really look like. They are complex, they are diverse, they look really, really messy. And actually, when you go and you study what old forests look like, forests that haven't been managed by people or haven't been managed by people for a really long time, you'll see that they are much less easy to appreciate because they look really messy. There's dead trees on the ground, and there's some big trees, big old trees, but there's also trees of all different shapes and sizes and ages. And those big trees are full of holes, and they have these complex canopies with broken tops, and there's dead standing trees, and it just looks a mess. But as you start to understand forests, and again, this reimagined understanding of forests as this bigger, broader thing, you realize that that mess is actually the vitality of a forest, and that the habitat for all that stuff, and in many cases, many of those less appreciated parts of what makes forests actually work, that's their habitat. They find their habitat in that dead wood on the forest floor, in those different sizes and ages of trees, and those imperfect big old trees. So this is something that is, to me, and I know better, it is sometimes hard to appreciate forests that look like this, but it's something that we should all endeavor to do. When I talk about forests, I talk about, I use these words diversity and complexity. We all know what diversity is, right? It's a lot of different kinds of stuff. And complexity is sort of like diversity to the nth degree. So it's like all these different layers of diversity layered on top of each other. And what you get is these forests which are complex. They are diverse in many different ways, but they also are, complex systems. And as complex systems, they have these amazing emergent properties. So properties that do not come from any one part of that system, but are sort of emerged from the sum of those parts. Diversity and complexity in our forests are things that tend to develop as forests get older. So many of our forests in Vermont, we'll talk about that in a second, are young. So 60 to 100 years old, which is old for a person, but really young for a forest, since they were a pasture maybe for 100 years. And so as forests develop, they become more complex, but most of our forests are not very complex because they just haven't had time to develop that diversity and that complexity. Another part of reimagining what forests are is acknowledging, like in that original definition by Thompson and Sorensen of a natural community, that it's not just even the living things, those physical pieces and parts of a forest that are important, it's also these processes. So forests change, they're dynamic, they will change, they have to change. And actually, when you learn to appreciate sort of the forests as they are, you'll understand that change, which is often embodied in the death of trees, is actually this really beautiful and important part of how they become complex and how they become diverse and how they sequester and store carbon and how they, produce clean air and clean water and all these really cool things they do, amazing wildlife habitat and support biodiversity. All this stuff is not in spite of the fact that forests change, but because of it. And so what we need to do is sort of move from this idea of stability. So stability is sort of this like, here are our trees and the trees are the forest. And so we need to keep all of these trees alive at all costs, right? Because if those trees fall over, the forest is dead, which is just completely not true. The forest, if those trees fall over, the forest has changed, right? Because the forest is this bigger, broader thing. And so we need to move from this idea of trying to encourage stability towards encouraging resilience. So resilient forests are forests that are capable of maintaining their health and their natural processes throughout great stress and change. So acknowledging that they will change and trying to protect forests' ability to be healthy as they change. We're also headed into a pretty uncertain time. So, we have some, when we think about how forests work, we have some reference conditions. We can go back to old forests and historical records, and we can think about, what forests are supposed to look like but in reality, our climate has changed and will continue to change. And there's a number of other things we're going to talk about that are different now than they were just a short period of time ago in the way that forests work. And so we need forests that are not just resilient, but are also able to adapt. They're moving, they're changing, and they're going to some other place, and we don't know exactly what form that is going to take. And so we need to manage forests that are adaptive. Resilience and adaptability are both features that are, there's a lot of different ways to manage for those features, but managing for diverse and for complex forests are some of the best ways to do that. The best way to manage for any of these features, and we'll talk about this many times, is to keep forest as forest, to not fragment it, to not develop it or turn it into some other type of land use. The second best way is often to keep them diverse and to protect them from biodiversity threats, which we'll also talk about. So, one of the things you can get really lost in when you think about forests, and you start to really get into this idea that forests are not just the trees, but are this complex web of life, is the smaller you go, the more crazy, interesting relationships you find. And so one of the things I've been really interested in recently is invertebrates. So invertebrates are bugs, and they are this incredibly, they serve all these really important roles in forests. They break down organic material, they pollinate the 60 to 80% of Vermont's plants that require insect pollination. They are food that provides sort of the base of that forest food web that feeds larger animals that are a little bit more easy to appreciate. They're all this really cool stuff, and they account for like 97% of all the species on Earth, to 99% because we actually don't know a lot of them. But so you get into these really, when you think about invertebrates, bugs, right? You get into all these really crazy facts. So here's a graphic of, this is all the different species of different kinds of animals, right? But without invertebrates included. This is in Vermont. So you've got, 58 species of mammals, and you got more than 250 species of birds, fish, amphibians, reptiles. This is what that looks like when we include invertebrates. So when we think about biodiversity, we have 58 species of mammals, and we have over 21,000 species of invertebrates that we know about. These are incredibly, incredibly, incredibly important organisms that we don't usually think about managing for the habitat of, right? The habitat of some of these organisms, one thing that I say when I'm feeling a little cheeky, everybody loves these pollinator meadows, these beautiful wildflower meadows that you get to see all these butterflies and bees. Most of those butterflies and some of Vermont's 300 species of native bees, they visit those pollinator meadows, but they live in the woods. They live in stuff like dead wood, dead, ugly, old trees, and dead wood on the forest floor, and that's sort of the duff layer, the leaf litter layer on the forest floor that we spend all this time and energy trying to clean up, when in fact we're marginalizing the ability of these organisms to find their habitat. I could go on about invertebrates forever. There's some pretty crazy facts about invertebrates, like, for instance, that the biomass of all the people on Earth is about equivalent to the biomass of all the ants on Earth. The biomass of all the people on Earth is also about equivalent to the biomass that all the spiders on Earth eat in a given year. So that's pretty crazy. There's a lot of bugs out there, people. E.O. Wilson thinks that we should start calling invertebrates wildlife, and he calls them the little things that make the world work. There's also all just endless really cool facts related to this thing that we call the Wood Wide Web. So this has like captured the imagination of a lot of people. We have known for a while that trees and plants, almost all of our native trees and plants, have mutualistic, so mutually beneficial associations with what we call mycorrhizal fungi. These are fungi that are underneath the soil, and that they grow these expansive webs of hyphae, these fungal threads. And what they do is they basically help trees extract nutrients from the soil, and they funnel those nutrients to the trees and also water, and the trees give them in exchange photosynthate, so the sugars that they create through the process of photosynthesis. What is more of a recent discovery is the fact that forests are also using those networks to share resources with each other, even between species, between generations, and to do all this really cool stuff like to send resources from a dying tree, to survive it out into this web to surviving trees, to subsidize shaded trees. There are these larger, older trees that have been called mother trees that are sort of the hubs in this network. And if you map this network, it's what we call a natural neural network. It looks like a brain if you map all these connections between all these different trees. It also allows them, this network also allows trees to communicate messages with each other. It's really, really cool. And we understand now that this wood wide web and the ability of us as forest managers to provide habitat, not just for the trees, again, and the animals, but also for stuff like fungi, is really critical to the resilience of forests, and especially to stuff like their ability to produce fertile soils and to sequester and store carbon. Almost all soil carbon, depending on where you are, about 60% often, is located in forest soils, and mycorrhizal fungi is a big part in that. Now, especially the mycorrhizal fungi thing is amazing, but one thing that happens sometimes when we think about that, there is a little bit of a temptation to, you're like, oh, forests are, trees are sharing and they're altruistic. All that is true. They're cooperating, but there is a temptation to mythologize forests and to think about them as like utopias, right? As these perfect communities. But the problem is that if we mythologize forests and we sort of, paint them with that brush, we miss perhaps what I think is, one of the most important lessons that forest has to teach us, which is that they're just messy and that they're imperfect, that trees die, that critters, organisms parasitize each other, they kill each other, they eat each other, they destroy each other's habitat. Those same fungal networks that connect trees and allow them to share are also used to pass harmful chemical compounds between each other. It's only when we start to accept that forests really are imperfect and they are messy that we really start to be able to understand them. And, a lot of people, I think, have learned about the way that trees are connected, and then they've applied them to our communities, and they're like, to our human communities. And they're like, well, our human communities should be more like these forest communities because the forest communities are perfect. And I agree that they're an interesting template for human communities, but I think the best lesson they have to teach us is that, they're just a process and they're never completed and they're just a mess. And if we recognize that they're just a mess, maybe that takes some of the pressure off of trying to make everything perfect all the time. So the next aspect that I want to talk about is legacy. So in forest, whether we're talking about forest management or in our human communities, legacy is a really powerful and loaded term. So the first part of this is that we need to recognize the legacies that we stand on. So in forests, we're talking about an altered, extremely altered, degraded, exploited landscape. In the same way that we need to recognize that we stand on these other, not so great legacies in our communities, right? Racism, injustice, inequity. The thing about both of those legacies, and this, I think about this often in a forest context, is we don't get to choose the legacies that we inherit, right? We get what we get. And so the choice that we have is, we can complain about that and be bummed that we inherit the legacy that we do, or we can do something about it. So what are we going to do about it? What's going to be our legacy that we leave for future generations, for our children and our children's children? Interestingly, legacy is also a term in forest ecology. It's a term for sort of the parts and the pieces of past forests that infuse the forest of today, and actually leaving stuff like legacy trees, which are just trees whose whole job is just to be big old trees and to eventually become big old dead trees and to provide to forests all those benefits of big old trees, is one of the things that I encourage now in forest management. All right, take a drink of water here. So the biggest and sort of most wide-reaching influence on our landscape was human land use that occurred primarily in this part of the world in the 1800s and sort of bleeding into the early 1900s. And so we've all heard the story that Vermont was, at that time, Vermont was in excess of 90% forested prior to European colonization, and became, over a relatively short period of time, really between like the 1810s and the 1830s, about 80% deforested, so only about 20% forested. That was for a combination of things, for sheep pasture, also for resource extraction. People needed a lot of fence posts at that time. Eventually, they needed a ton of railroad ties. They were burning wood for everything, and this is before the advent of the wood stove, so a typical home might burn 40, 50, 60 cords of wood a year. They were just using wood for everything. And so even if it wasn't pastured at that time, it was probably cleared at that time. And so what that means is that every forest you've ever been in, probably, except for a really, really remote one or a really high elevation one maybe, was a field or was clear cut at that time. Pretty amazing feat when you consider that they were using axes and hand saws and draft animals. And so this was actually, the biggest driver that we all talk about for this was merino wool. So this was a special kind of sheep that in the Napoleonic Wars in Europe it was originally like the King of Spain's precious sheep that wasn't allowed to be exported, but then Napoleon came and this guy, William Jarvis, was able to export a lot of these sheep to his farm in Wethersfield, Vermont. And the wool was really, really nice, and it was worth a lot more money than normal wool. And so there was sort of a gold rush on that. And, sheep can graze just about everywhere. And so even these really rocky marginal areas were cleared as pasture during that time. By 1837, there were somewhere between 1 and 2 million merino sheep in Vermont, which is pretty amazing. But this was pretty short-lived. So by the 1850s, there were some other markets opening up overseas. There were tariffs that were being dropped, a whole lot of things, westward expansion, a whole lot of things were contributing to the eventual decline of that wool industry. And so we saw some of those more marginal pastures really start to revert back to forest in the 1850s, but a lot of them remained pastures until the early 1900s, the 1960s. So at the same time, so if you can imagine what would happen to the habitat of all the species that lived here if they went from being a 95% forested state to being a 20% forested state. We lost a lot of species, and we also lost them due to stuff like bounties. So in this picture, you see the last catamount that was ever shot in Vermont in 1881. There was bounties in Vermont on wolves and catamount until they were extinct. Which is a pretty crazy thing when you think about how we treat endangered species now. And also species, fur bearers like beaver and fisher and marten were trapped, until they were extirpated. So until they were sort of locally extinct. We also, by the end of the 1700s and the 1800s, we had no beaver in Vermont. We had no beaver, no turkeys, no fisher, no moose. We had extirpated caribou and elk, which were the two main large ungulates on our landscape, with moose, a species called eastern elk, which is now extinct. No wolves, no bear, no otter, no Canada geese, no marten, no passenger pigeons, which are actually a really cool, weird influence on our landscape. Pretty amazing impact. And if you think about, again, that all of those species have an ecological role, what is the impact on our forest during that time, besides just this, in addition to this wholesale forest clearing? There were, the loss of some of these species really led to ecosystem-wide effects. There's some really weird ones. This is a picture of beaver reintroduction in the 1920s in Vermont. Beavers were reintroduced, as were turkeys and fisher. The loss of beavers is really clear because we call them a keystone species because they create these really unique wetland habitats that support all these other species, and also stuff like water quality. There were some other weird ones. There was a porcupine bounty in Vermont for a long time because all the fishers, which are a fur bearer, they're a large member of the weasel family, they were all extirpated. And they were the natural predator of the porcupine. And so there were just porcupines everywhere, just like eating people's houses. And you could, club a porcupine and turn in a pair of porcupine ears to the town clerk and collect the bounty for a long time. You know, you can make an argument as well that, you know, as our deer population rises, which is not just linked to the loss of their predators, but also to forest fragmentation and decreasing winter severity and some other stuff. But that certainly the loss of their historic predators is part of it. That you know, sort of our deer population increases is part of that picture. There's some pretty amazing also facts about some of these species, passenger pigeons, and also beaver. We now think that, you know, by the time most people settled in Vermont in the 1800s, most of the beavers had already been trapped, and that started in really in the late 1600s or early 1600s, and by the late 1700s, there were very few beaver that were here. By the 1670, nearly 250,000 beaver pelts had been shipped to Europe from the Connecticut River Valley alone. And so when we construct these historical patterns, we think that in our valleys, there may have been as many as 300 beaver dams per square mile. So a square mile is 640 acres. So that's a beaver dam every 2 acres. So if you think about what a massive ecological shift that would have been to suddenly have no beavers on the landscape, both to the populations of all the species of wildlife that rely on them, the functions that all those species serve in adjacent and connected ecosystems, and also the impacts on, you know, water quality and stuff like that, flood attenuation, it would have been massive. Okay, so in addition to all that, you know, we were managing forests poorly, extractively. Sort of in the early 1900s, the idea that we would even really think that hard about how we managed forests was weird to most people. When we did start managing forests, we you know, developed this really European forestry model, this idea of the regulated forest. The idea of the regulated forest is that we should be growing timber as efficiently as possible by controlling every single aspect of how it grows. You know, sort of related to that, we had this idea of decadent versus thrifty trees. So these big old trees that we now know to serve these really important ecosystem functions, you know, provide amazing habitat. They're hubs in that mycorrhizal wood wide web, that fungal network. You know, those were just inefficiently, they weren't growing valuable timber as well as young trees. And so they were cut or killed just to get them out of the way. People are also just high grading, so cutting the healthiest trees, which are also worth the most money, diameter limit cutting, so just cutting the biggest trees, which are often the healthiest trees. In the case of both of those management methods, you're just cutting the healthiest trees and leaving the less healthy trees, so you're making the forest less healthy, and they weren't protecting soil well. So in the case of all these things, you know, none of these are good ways. Some of these, you know, like the regulated forest, sometimes you can grow a plantation of Norway spruce or something. You know, you can grow timber efficiently that way, but you're not growing a forest. Again, forests are all of these other pieces and parts, and you can't just hammer away at them and take whatever you want and expect them to function normally. And so we're left with this legacy of all those things. And this is a legacy which is very much real. And you know, sort of when I walk in the forest, I am thinking about, I'm seeing this human legacy as much or more than I'm seeing the expression of the ecology of that site. So it's an enormous influence in the way that our forests are. So today our forests are younger, they have less big trees, they're less diverse, they have less complexity, deadwood, soil carbon, all these things that are associated with older forests. Our landscapes lack a historical balance of, you know, young and old forests, and also different kinds of forests. So we don't want to promote just diversity within a given forest, different sizes and ages of trees, but also we want different kinds of forests across the landscape. We want young forest and middle-aged forest and old forest, because all of those things provide unique habitat that's utilized by different species. And so when all of our forests are about the same age as they are, we don't have as much of a balance as we would have had a few hundred years ago. We have different tree species because there are certain tree species which are more successful under old undisturbed forest conditions as they are growing out of an old field. An example of this is that we think that beech was 40%-ish of all the trees in Vermont, 60% in some areas of Chittenden County. And today it's 3 to 5%, which is a function of both an invasive disease called beech bark disease, but then also just the fact that the way that beech grows, it's sort of the tortoise and the hare race. It takes a long time to establish and to become dominant, and it just hasn't had time in these young forests. So altered tree species composition, altered wildlife species dynamics, right? Because we lost a lot of species and we still are lacking some of those species that would have been here just a few hundred years ago. Those species, we know that forests affect animals by providing them habitat, but what we think less about is that animals affect forests. So animals are influencing the way that they grow, they're dispersing their seeds, they're performing these really important roles in soils, they're doing all this stuff that's absolutely critical. And so when you alter those dynamics, fundamentally, you change the way that forests work. So in the midst of all this, we're also dealing with global change. And so, obviously we think a lot about climate change, as well we should, but we also need to realize that climate change is not the only thing that's threatening our world. And that climate change is actually just one part of what we call global change. Global change is climate change plus all these other things that we're doing to our ecosystems at the same time. So introducing invasive exotic plants, animals, pests, and pathogens, losing forests, converting forests to other land uses, fragmenting them into smaller pieces, polluting them, biodiversity loss. All of these things are also, and many of these things have feedback, so they're climate change affects them. But all of these things are part of the picture of what our forests are really facing, more so than just climate change. And so one of the things that's really important is forests are this incredibly powerful asset in mitigating climate change, but also, forests are more complicated than that, and they're facing more threats than that. So as we try and think about how to keep our forests healthy, you sort of have to make some compromises, and there's things you have to do sometimes that are not necessarily the maximum climate, carbon benefit, but are really necessary for protecting biodiversity in light of all these other threats. We're in the middle of, I'm going to say it a lot of times, in the middle of this mass extinction event, this global loss of biodiversity, in the middle of this geologic era in which humans are the dominant influence on climate and ecology. We call it the Anthropocene now. Global animal populations are less than 50% of what they were in 1970. It's actually, we've lost about 60% of all the animals on Earth since 50 years ago. That's not 60% of the species, but 60% of the physical animals that we know of. And they're going extinct at this huge rate. We think that maybe 1 million animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction, about 40% of amphibians, a third of reef-forming corals, a third of marine mammals. We've lost at least 680 vertebrate species that we know of since the 16th century. And invertebrates, which again are like 97 and 99% of all the species on Earth, we've lost conservatively 100,000 species, but we don't really know. And so you have to sort of ask yourself, again, we inherit this legacy. What is the influence of all the loss of all these species, not just as, oh, wow, that species is really cool and I wish it was still here, but what is its ecological role and what is the effect of the loss of those species on our ecosystems? Globally, we're losing global forest cover, losing biodiversity. A big part of that is because of the United States and the way the Western world in general and the way that we consume resources. So the US is like less than 5% of global population, but we consume a third of its resources. And a lot of that deforestation and environmental degradation is a result of resource consumption, extraction, processing. And our global resource consumption is increasing. And we know that climate change and all these other things, resource extraction, ecological loss, biodiversity loss, all these things disproportionately affect poorer and more vulnerable communities, which is when we start talking about environmental and climate injustice. So we just know that Impoverished communities, communities of color are much more likely to live in polluted areas, less likely to have access to clean air and clean water. There's a million data that you can look up about the ways in which the health of our ecosystems, which are fundamental to our ability to live here, that as they're degraded, they do not affect us all equally. And it's pretty dire. And you just need to know that, you know, protecting our ecosystems is really, really important to protect those among us that are most vulnerable. As we consume resources, those among us that are really privileged are much less likely to see the effects of those than people who are less so. And so we just need to acknowledge that we live in this really, really highly altered landscape, and we're just here, and we're standing on this legacy, good, bad, or otherwise, as we make our sort of management decisions and think about how to move forward. So there's this idea of responsibility, right? I started thinking about this word in this context after reading the book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, which is this really cool book about the land ethic, our relationship to the land. And she talked about, when we, as landowners, when we buy a piece of land, we think about, we own this bundle of rights, right? These are all the things we have a right to do with this land. What we don't think about is having a bundle of responsibilities. So what do we owe to this land? And more broadly, whether you're a landowner or not, you are affecting ecosystems with everything that you do every day. So you got to just sort of ask yourself, what do we owe to our forests and our other ecosystems? What do we owe to each other? What do we owe to future generations? What's our responsibility to work to correct issues, these legacies that we didn't even cause? I'll just sort of leave it at that. And it's really, there's this sort of really interesting experiment when we think about having a responsibility to our ecosystems, but then also having responsibility to each other. As a landowner in Vermont, you have to recognize that, and this is true throughout the Northeastern United States, the vast majority of our land is owned by private landowners. And so, one of the important things of the work that I do in the County Forester program in general is, Vermont's 75% forested, 80% of those forests are privately owned. And so we're cobbling together all these things, the ability of our forests to mitigate climate change and to provide habitat for all of our species and to provide clean air and to provide clean water and to regulate our climate and all this other stuff. We're cobbling that together from forests that are mostly just people, individuals and families. And we need those people to understand the responsibility that they have, not just to their land, but also to everybody, because those private forests are producing these massive public benefits. And this graphic is just showing the breakdown of who owns our forests in Vermont. This is something I don't know. I think when you talk to people about intrinsic value, this is something that I believe, that everything, all of our native species have the right to exist, right? And if you ask people about it that way, like, does an owl, does it, a bear, like, do these things have the right to exist? Most people say yes. But it's also not something that we internalize in our decision-making process. So I think that it's really important to also consider, do things besides humans have the right to exist? And this idea of intrinsic value, and if they do, and I would argue that they do, how do we incorporate that into our decision-making process? It doesn't need to be the only consideration, but it should be a consideration. And then there's this idea with relationships. So given that this is all true, let's say just for argument's sake that everything I've said, you're like, okay, I get it, I'm in. And you agree, we have some responsibility to then do something about it. So how do we form a relationship with ecosystems that is actually positive in a holistic sense? And I would predicate this by saying that we have a relationship with our ecosystems whether we want to or not. It's just about how do we want to, do we want to create that actively or do we want to create it passively? This is another amazing book by Elizabeth Kolbert called The Sixth Extinction. And what she's basically framing is the fact that we are, like it or not, we are completely dependent on ecosystems for everything that we use, everything that, you know, sustains our lives and that makes our lives beautiful, everything. And so it's weird, you know, it's more, ecosystems are more than something that we can choose to like or not like. As far as we remove ourselves from them sort of ideologically, we remain biological organisms and we are completely dependent upon them, like it or not. What she says is, having freed ourselves from the constraints of evolution, humans nevertheless remain completely dependent on the Earth's biological and geochemical systems. So like it or not, we're tied to them. And the question, again, we have a relationship to ecosystems, whether you like it or not. The question is not if we want to have an impact on them. The question is, what do we want that impact to be? So everything we do, everything we consume, everything we wear, everything's made of something, right? And every ounce of energy that we consume comes from somewhere. And we can choose the impacts of our actions and the choices that we make actively by using like local resources, those we can understand, or we can do so passively and sort of abdicate our ability to choose to make those choices, to choose the impacts of the resources that we consume. When we think about this, you know, in many cases, when we sort of say that we don't want to have that impact locally, we're still having an impact. We're just having that impact on someone else and an ecosystem somewhere else. And sometimes, you know, sort of the really hard part about, you know, consuming local resources, it can be really beautiful, like on local farms. It can also be really challenging. Resource production is messy. Even renewable resources, and it can make us really uncomfortable, right? But the trade-off is that when we say, no, we don't want to have any resources produced near us, but we're still consuming them, that we then lose all control over where they come from and how they impact. And in many cases, I think those impacts end up being a lot more dire because we don't have to deal with them. There's this idea of the land ethic. Another book recommendation, Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold. Aldo Leopold wrote this book about the land ethic like in the 40s, and it is still feels really cutting edge. The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community, our human community, to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively the land. A land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to citizen of it. It implies respect for his fellow members and also respect for the community as such. And so it's just this idea of ascribing to our ecosystems the respect to be considered worthy of our ethical consideration, and to be sort of, you know, sort of like part of our community, because as we move forward and build a better world, we need to be able to do that with them, right? Recognizing that they're this incredibly critical part of how we're all here and what makes our lives good. Within the land ethic, I often run against this really interesting duality. I'm not going to talk about this too much, but I call it takers and leavers. There are these people, so within this framework, and this is a spectrum, and most people fall somewhere in the middle of the spectrum, but within this framework, takers are people who believe that the only purpose of forests or other ecosystems is to provide us with resources, economic gain, you know, fun, pleasure, and that anything we do to them to do that is okay. Anything we do. Leavers, on the other hand, are those who believe that anything we do to ecosystems is wrong, and there's no way that we can possibly do anything right. So in my mind, both of these stances are problematic in their own way, because both fail to actually develop a real holistic relationship with ecosystems. So takers disregard the idea that their actions could harm ecosystems, that they're sort of worthy of not just destroying wantonly. And leavers completely abdicate their ability to do anything about anything, you know, any of those harmful legacies that we've created. And we have all this power, and we know what we want to do, but we can't do anything because anything we do is wrong. Which brings us to this question of power. So at the same time that we're these biological organisms, right? We're part of these ecosystems, we're completely dependent upon them. We also need to recognize that we have this incredible power like no organism on Earth ever has. And so how do we use that power not to further, continue down this path of degradation, to degrade ecosystems, but instead to enrich them, to make them healthier, to help build a better world? And in sort of my one little corner of what that's about, and there's a gajillion different ways that you could sort of expand that idea out. I think about forest management because I'm a forester, and it's my job to think about, how can the forest management that we do, which is often the cutting of trees, how can forest management have a positive influence on forests, sort of reimagining forest management, sort of like we did with forests, and how can forests and forest management have a positive influence on our world? I really believe that forests and forest management can have a tremendous positive influence on our world, and that forest management can be a really positive influence on forests. It's not always, this is the thing about power, having the ability to use the same tool like a chainsaw and a skidder to degrade forests, and also to make them more complex and diverse and vibrant, to correct some of these issues that have been created by humans across the landscape. I do a type of forestry we call ecological forestry, or ecological forest management, ecological silviculture. And it's just this idea, which shouldn't be radical, but it is, that we manage forests like they manage themselves. So we manage them as these complex systems, these reimagined, big, huge systems that are full of all these different organisms and processes. And we don't think that forest management is about just managing trees, it's about all that stuff. But within that, we use the cutting of trees often as a tool to enact those changes, often by creating these sort of simulation natural disturbances. Essentially, we study what old forests are like, and then we try to make them like that actively, sometimes centuries sooner than that would naturally occur. And with that, we hope to achieve all these, a lot more wildlife habitat, a diversity of different conditions, and to support biodiversity across our landscape, and to help our forests be more resilient in the face of global change. Using this way, we can make young forests more like old forests. In practice, this looks like different sizes and ages of trees, lots of dead wood everywhere. It looks like a natural disturbance, and we aspire to make it look like as much like a natural disturbance as possible. Also, lots of dead trees. We retain and recruit big old legacy trees. So I talked about biological legacy trees whose sole job is just to be big trees, because if we cut all the big trees, there won't be any big trees, and big trees are an important part of forests. Creating small pockets of habitats like early successional forests that might be underrepresented across the landscape. Basically, it's just this idea of trying to manage forests in a way that we're extracting a local renewable resource, but that we're also recognizing this is how forests work, and working within that rather than trying to impose some system that has nothing to do with how forests actually work. And we do that within the context of managing for ecologically functional landscapes. And this is sort of one thing that's incumbent upon all of us, is to think about our broader landscape and the things that we want to encourage in our communities. So yes, we want to make younger and simpler forests more resilient, more diverse and complex. Really, across our landscape, it is incredibly critical to protect forests in general, to protect forest blocks, so big areas of forest unfragmented by roads and houses, and to keep those areas intact and forested, to create pockets of habitat that are underrepresented across the landscape, so we have sort of a landscape with a better mix of a diversity of different kinds of forests. Also to allow some forests to be unmanaged. It's this really weird thing where, it seems like to folks who are interested in forest management, sometimes the idea of not managing an acre of forest seems like this profound threat to what they do. And to people who who hate forest management, the idea of managing any forest at all is this profound threat to everything they believe in, when in reality, both responsible forest management and having areas of forest that are not managed are completely complementary. They support each other, and they're all part of how we manage for functional landscapes. And addressing landscape level threats is really important. So there are these massive biodiversity threats that are all of our problem. Some of the big ones that we're dealing with across the landscape are invasive plants and also invasive pests and pathogens. Deer overpopulation's not a huge problem in Vermont in most areas of the state, although in some areas it increasingly is. The Champlain Valley is one of those places, and the Connecticut River Valley. But it is becoming more so. Again, loss of the historic predators. We have 50% of the hunters that we had 50 years ago, which is the current apex predator of deer. Increase in posted land, decreased winter severity, all of those things make the deer population higher. And when there's too many deer, they nibble all the young trees and all the young plants, and can have actually incredibly profound influence on the ability of the forest to regenerate and to be diverse. Development. I actually just got back for Thanksgiving being in Long Island, New York. And if you want to see what invasive plants or deer overpopulation or development get like when they're really, really bad, and give us a reason to sort of head them off now when it doesn't seem like they're that bad yet in a lot of places, just go south and you can just see what it's like. And you can see if those are the forests that we want. And for me, I came back and I was like shook. It's a reason to really, really start doing stuff. Part of addressing those threats, it's not all just easy, and most of it is really not easy. It's uncomfortable. You got to do stuff like cutting trees. I love trees and I cut them all the time. Killing deer, I love deer and I kill them as part of a local renewable source of meat, and also because I know that we need to lower their population, and humans are the only ones that have the power to do that. Using herbicide on invasive plants, like this is a thing that I talk about now all the time, which is so surreal for me. But with these invasive plants, if you don't use herbicide, you don't kill them. And there are ways to use herbicide that are responsible, and there are ways to use herbicide that are not responsible, but there are ways you can do it that you're using this tool like a chainsaw that can be used to degrade forests and to suppress biodiversity as a restoration tool. And that's really hard to wrap our heads around, but sometimes, and many times, that's just what we got to do. Same thing, creating rules that restrict development in our community, right? Nobody wants to tell anybody that they can't do whatever they want to do, but if we want to protect our ecosystems, at some point, we have to stop losing forest and stop fragmenting it into smaller and smaller pieces. And this is a continuing theme, right? This idea of local renewable resources. So we're consuming that. We're consuming resources all the time. You're doing it right now. Know where they come from as much as you can. And understand that, like I mentioned before, when they're extracted, it's uncomfortable sometimes, a lot of times, and messy. There are parts of producing resources that are beautiful, even through all of that. The good parts are, local economic opportunity and the ability to keep your impact at home, so that you're saying, okay, I'm using these resources, and so I'm not going to displace the impact of my choices and my life on ecosystems and on people somewhere else. I'm going to deal with that discomfort right here. And if there's a type of resource production that you're really uncomfortable with, and you're like, no way, I don't feel comfortable with this in my community, well, maybe you shouldn't be using that resource, because why should you, use a resource that you're not comfortable with in your own community and send it to someone else's community? And this is one of the ways that I think that forest management can be really radical and profound and beautiful, is that we can, number one, we can help our forests recover from this legacy of human land use by sort of, creating these really diverse conditions, making them more complex way before that would naturally happen, and creating all of these habitats that haven't been here for hundreds of years. And at the same time, we can produce this incredibly amazing local renewable resource that's produced from a living system while we make it healthier. I can't even imagine a resource that would be better than that. We can reject this not in my backyard mentality, which is a huge driver of environmental racism and environmental injustice, that those of us with the privilege to say not in my backyard say it, and that the people who don't have to deal with the implications of that. Take charge over the environmental and social impacts of our resource production and the resources that we use, trying to use renewable resources instead of non-renewable and gross toxic resources. Like if you spill on the ground, spill wood on the ground, you know, that it's not despoiled for 100 years. That's pretty cool. There are also these other interesting aspects for forest landowners of being able to harvest wood and make a little money. Like it might make it affordable to own land, you know, so that you don't have to be rich to own land. You can get a little money out of your forest periodically, and it can make it so you can pay the taxes. And we think it also lowers development pressure. So by providing a potential source of income, it makes it so that people don't get taxed off their land and have to sell out, and which contributes to parcelization, forest fragmentation, forest loss, development. And so as we think about all these things, I just want to really drive home the point that it's radical and brave to dive into these, you know, these murky, these uncertain waters between simple truths, to recognize that many things can be true at the same time. You know, that we can love forests and we can manage forests, that we can love deer and kill deer, that we can not love herbicides and that we can use herbicides to kill invasive plants, that forest management isn't good or bad, that it can be done in ways that are beautiful and regenerative, and it can be done in ways that are harmful. And that protecting unmanaged forests can be done in a way that are really an important part of how we safeguard our biodiversity, or in a way that simply enhances local and global inequity. So preservation for the rich, right? This is not about, when I say all this stuff, it's not about finding a midpoint between all these different polarities. It's about acknowledging that the truth is complicated. And it's about, you know, deepening and enriching our understanding of the world, broadening our view, you know, reimagining the world that we want, the forests, and everything else, and thinking about how do we build a better world with all of these things integrated. And so it's about healthy local and global ecosystems at the same time that we have healthy local and global communities, right? It's about how do we move into the future, recognizing that forests and people are integrated, and what does a better world look like if both of those things are true. All right. So with that, oh, did I do it? Yeah. Okay. So with that, I'll stop talking for a second, but then if you have any questions, pop them into the chat, and we'll discuss. Hold on one second. I'm gonna stop.